And so again, we're going to lead from those early schools into something that looks a little bit more like the field of psychology that we know today. And so we're going to call these modern perspectives, not because all of them are fully formed and in use right now, but because they are at least a little bit closer to what is used right now. And we're going to walk through each of these separately, so each one will get its own slide or couple of slides, and we'll talk about early existences of this perspective, and then also what's closer to what we see right now in the field. And that should make sense as we go through this. So our first modern perspective is the psychodynamic perspective. And again, these are terms that are going to come up over and over again in this course as we talk about different things and we consider different perspectives. So it's going to be a good idea to learn these early on because they come back over and over and over. But our psychodynamic perspective is concerned with looking for causes of behavior within the inner workings of our personality. And when you see psychodynamic, you should start thinking about they're focused very heavily on the role of unconscious processes. So things that we aren't necessarily aware of, things that exist in the back of our mind that we don't think about. And our famous figure here is Sigmund Freud. So anytime you hear psychodynamic, your brain should think about Freud because he pioneered this field. And if you've learned about Freud in the past, he was a very controversial figure. And we talk about Freud fairly often in this course, not because we still believe or still follow a lot of his theories, but because his theories led us to other theories, to better theories, and helped shape how psychology has formed. So most of Freud's theories, they were proposed very early on in the field of psychology, and a lot of them are very, very wrong. And we've had lots of evidence that disagrees with his theories, so most of them have been completely thrown out. But again, he was so controversial and he was so exuberant in the things he proposed that he led to a lot of discussion and evolution within the field, which was good for psychology overall. So for our psychodynamic perspective, the driving way of looking at things from a psychodynamic perspective was using psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis is the investigation of internal and, again, unconscious psychological forces. So you're analyzing your psychology, your psyche. And again, with some of the weird things that came from Freud and the way that he framed questions, they focused a lot on the idea that humans are born with powerful sexual and aggressive drives, things that are kept hidden in our unconscious that we repress because they're not appropriate to be expressed in society. It's not acceptable to talk about or act on your sexual drives. That's something that you repress and keep hidden, and that conflict of hiding part of yourself expresses itself in our behaviors. And that sounds really weird because it is. And that's why psychodynamic perspective, especially in its earlier forms, wasn't something that was widely accepted. Make sure I said all of this stuff. So our behavior, it's going to depend on that unconscious conflict of us trying to hold back things that are not appropriate to be expressing in public. And a lot of these things, when they talk about we're born with these drives, a lot of the focus of the psychodynamic perspective was looking at those unconscious drives, but also especially in early childhood. So the common view of Freud is this guy sitting in his office and he has someone stretched out on a couch and they're asking you to tell them about your mother or tell them about your childhood. And so a lot of the focus on the early psychodynamic perspective was about childhood and repressed emotions and things that weren't in your conscious awareness. And so again, a very controversial theory at the beginning. But interestingly, there is currently a modern psychodynamic theory. This perspective hasn't completely died out. So modern psychodynamic theory has distanced itself from a lot of the stuff that came from Freud. They don't focus on sexual urges and desires, but they do still focus on the role of the unconscious, but they don't completely ignore conscious as well. So they're going to consider things that you are conscious or aware of. They're also going to consider things that you are unconscious or unaware of. And they still focus on personality and how your personality influences your behavior. They still have a pretty strong focus on early life experiences. So they want to look at your relationship with family members and caregivers, but it's a lot less about your deep, dark, hidden desires and more about how you grew up, in what environment, and how that's shaped who you are as a person. So the modern psychodynamic theory is very different from what most people think about when they hear the words psychodynamic theory. So our next perspective is the behavioral perspective. And this is a perspective that focuses very heavily on the role of external environmental factors in determining our behavior. So when we're talking about external environmental factors, that basically means anything outside of the body. So if we wanted to look at learning and how you can learn about things in your environment, that's coming from an external factor. So we can use the example of a child. When you're very young, you don't necessarily know that the stove produces heat. But if a child accidentally touches a burner on the stove and their hand is burned, they've learned that the stove is hot and they shouldn't touch it. So the stimulus of the stove being hot and causing pain has allowed them to learn something about their environment. And so this behavioral perspective focuses on the idea that our behavior is based on our previous experience, stuff that we've learned about in the past, as well as present stimuli. So if you've learned that stoves can be hot, if you're in the kitchen and you need to clean off the top of the stove, maybe you're going to check if the burner is hot before you clean it off. So the present stimulus of having to touch the stove is going to make you think about your previous experience, and your behavior changes so you make sure you don't burn yourself again. And our important person for the behavioral perspective, and there's going to be a couple here, but the earliest one is John Locke. And his major contribution was the idea that the human mind begins in a state of tabula rasa. And tabula rasa just means a blank slate. And so what Locke was getting at is that when we're born, we don't know anything. He was very against the idea that people would have instincts or things that we are born knowing. He thought that we were born knowing nothing at all, and that we would learn everything about our environment from interacting with the environment. And so this idea of all of our knowledge coming from our external environment is one of the core ideas that defines this behavioral perspective. And so even though John Locke, if we look at our dates here, had this idea a very, very long time ago, the behavioral perspective didn't really take off until the early 1900s. And some of the names that we're going to start talking about should be familiar. These are very famous figures that you might have heard mentioned before. So the first of these is Ivan Pavlov. So Pavlov is responsible for our understanding of Pavlovian or classical conditioning. So this was the person that trained dogs to salivate when they heard a bell. And we'll get into this in tons of detail in our chapter on learning, but Pavlov was looking at the idea that learning can occur when events are associated with each other. So we can learn to form associations between different events, between different stimuli. And then we have Edward Thorndike, who had some very similar ideas, and he said that organisms can learn through the consequences of their actions. So Pavlov's talking about learning associations or links between different events, and Thorndike is talking about learning because of the consequence of a behavior. And again, we'll talk about this at length later, so we'll get into more details on that. But we will talk very, very briefly about the law of effect, which came from Thorndike's ideas here. And so if organisms are learning because of the consequences of their actions, we can make a broad statement, the law of what's going on. So the law of effect basically says that if you do a behavior, if you do something, and the outcome or the consequence of doing that thing is good, then you're going to do that thing more often. So if a child cleans their room, and as a result, you're going to give them a piece of cake, then they're going to be more likely to clean their room because getting cake is good. And the law of effect also includes the opposite. So if you do something and the outcome or the consequence is bad, then you're going to do that thing less. So if you talk too loudly on your phone and your mom tells you to be quiet, then maybe you're going to talk less loudly. You're not going to talk loudly as often. You're going to adjust your behavior because of the consequences. And so from these two major ideas, or these two major figures, behaviorism started taking off. And there's going to be lots of people that we mention in regards to behaviorism. And we've already kind of talked about the core idea of behaviorism, where we're emphasizing the environmental control of behavior through learning. So we're focusing on environmental influences on our behavior, those external forces. And our next person is John B. Watson. And Watson was very keen on behaviorism, specifically because the mentalism from earlier schools was troublesome. And when we're talking about mentalism, we're talking about that idea of considering the mind and how the mind works and what shapes the mind. And so up until this point, a lot of psychology was only people considering how the mind worked. They focused on the mental side of psychology, and as a result, they tended to neglect the behavior side of psychology. And so John Watson jumped on the behavioral perspective because it seemed to be a good way to bring psychology back into balance. He thought that psychology should focus on observable behavior, not the unobservable inner consciousness. So he wanted to get back to the behavior side of things and not spend a lot of time focusing on the mind. And so if we've had this idea of behaviorism, and it seems fairly reasonable, but of course there are people who take it to extremes. So the next step in behaviorism was the idea of radical behaviorism. And so instead of saying that the environment is the majority of what's driving our behavior, someone who subscribed to the idea of radical behaviorism would say that the environment is the only factor controlling our learning and behavior. And the big name for radical behaviorism is B.F. Skinner. And again, we'll talk about him a ton in our chapter on learning. But Skinner went so far as to say that no account of what's happening inside the human body, no matter how complete, will explain the origins of human behavior. And this is a pretty extreme statement. So he was saying that it doesn't matter what you're looking at within the human body. You are never going to get anything out of the body or the mind that can explain human behavior. So he's saying that the only way to explain behavior is to look externally, to look at the environment and the things that we can learn from our environment. So a pretty big swing where most of the behavioral perspective, the idea of behaviorism, just wants to look more at the environmental influence. But radical behaviorism completely discounts or ignores the possibility that the mind could be involved. And B.F. Skinner, as well as if we go back here to Pavlov and Thorndike, they were all involved in producing techniques collectively known as behavior modification. So by studying learning and how learning shapes our behavior, they put together some techniques that helped us modify behavior. And we'll get into that in that chapter. There we go. And so if we went more extreme with our radical behaviorism, there was also a counter idea with cognitive behaviorism. And cognitive behaviorism is almost like a less extreme form of behaviorism. And so if we add cognitive in the front here, we could assume that we're going to start thinking about the mind. So we're going to bring that mental component back into behaviorism. So we're getting away from the idea that the environment is the only important factor, and we're going to start looking at both the mind and the environment and how both can influence our behavior. So for cognitive behaviorism, they had the idea that learning experiences and the environment affect our behavior specifically because they're giving us information that we need to mentally evaluate a situation and behave effectively. So we're bringing that mental component back in. And Albert Bandura was one of the major proponents of this less intense form of behaviorism with our cognitive behaviorism. And so it's not just environment, it's environment and experience that affect our thoughts. And so from our behaviorism idea, we can move into our next perspective, which is the humanistic perspective. And when we're looking at a humanistic perspective, you might assume correctly that it's going to focus majorly on humans. So whereas our behavioral perspective could look at humans or any animal, the humanistic perspective was specific to humans. It's very difficult to apply a humanistic perspective to any other animal. So that's one of those restrictions that you'll need to keep in mind about this perspective. But the humanistic perspective emphasizes the role of free will, personal growth, and the human drive to find meaning in your own existence. So again, this kind of arose in contrast to behaviorism. So behaviorism was a very cold science where we were looking at humans as creatures that only reacted to their environment. And the humanistic perspective swung the other way, where they were saying that humans aren't just controlled by unconscious forces, which would be our psychodynamic perspective. And they're saying that humans don't just react to their environments, we're motivated by other things, more human qualities. And our driving force for the humanistic perspective is Abraham Maslow. So if you've ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is where that came from. And so Maslow focused on the idea of self-actualization as a driving force for human behavior. And self-actualization is a rather abstract concept, but it's this idea of reaching your maximal potential as a human. So you have achieved self-actualization if you are content and you've reached all your goals as a human being. And the vagueness and difficulty of quantifying self-actualization is one of the major drawbacks to the humanistic perspective. But again, we'll get more into depth on this perspective as the course goes on. So there is a more modern take on our humanistic perspective. We've moved on since Maslow originally proposed his hierarchy of needs and self-actualization, but the modern humanistic perspective still includes information on self-actualization. They're focusing on personal growth, and you can see a lot of this in the modern positive psychology movement. So positive psychology is another subfield of psychology that seems to be pretty popular right about now. And so these perspectives are going to emphasize human strengths and fulfillment and living an optimal life. So very human-centric and looking at being the best human that you can be. So our next perspective is the cognitive perspective. And we've already kind of touched on the idea of cognitive as a perspective when we mentioned our cognitive behaviorism. And so when we start talking about the cognitive perspective, we're focusing on the human mind. And not necessarily just human minds. You can study cognition in other species as well, which is really cool. But our cognitive perspective is looking specifically at the nature of the mind and how our mental processes, all of those internal thoughts, are influencing our behavior. And so when we start talking about the cognitive perspective, we look at humans as a model of information processors. So humans are governed by thought, and we're going to process and react to different information that we're taking in from our environment. And so because it's focused on the nature of the mind, a lot of the ideas that shaped this cognitive perspective came out of the conflict between structuralism and functionalism as different schools of thought. And so one major area of the cognitive perspective is called Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt psychology is focused on a very particular trait of the human mind. And it's concerned with the idea that our mind organizes elements of an experience into a unified whole. So people are really good at grouping things together. You're probably familiar with the saying that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And that's because humans really like to stick things together, to consider them in groups, and to create different organizations. And so a really great example of how Gestalt psychology works is looking at our propensity for human faces. So at the bottom here, you would think that, so this is a normal human face. This oval here looks like it's stretched out a little bit. It looks like it's very tall vertically. And then this one here looks like it's kind of squished in. But you might expect, having some experience with optical illusions, if we flip it upside down, if we remove that extra information that our mind is adding, because humans love to look at faces, as soon as we flip those upside down, you realize that all of the ovals are the exact same size. And the size differences that we saw when we were looking at them right side up wasn't because the ovals were different sizes, it was because the face inside was adjusted. And our minds try and organize things into a unified whole. So Gestalt psychology looks at how some of our mental shortcuts are beneficial to us, but also how they can give us some problems. So it's a very interesting field, and again, we'll get into more of that as we start getting into our perception and perspectives. And so hopping back to the history side of things, when I had mentioned that the cognitive perspective came out of our structuralism and functionalism debate, that implies that this perspective came about quite a bit earlier in the history of psychology. And it did. We're talking about it later on in our list of perspectives, though, because the cognitive perspective was originally abandoned. So after it was put together out of structuralism and functionalism, people tended to leave it alone because behaviorism was becoming popular. So the idea of focusing on the environment and those external ideas kind of replaced the cognitive perspective until something changed. And so in the 1950s, the thing that changed was our goals and values at the time. So during World War II, a lot of research changed, a lot of our priorities changed, and a lot of the ways that we were looking at things changed in the field. So in World War II, they were starting to build airplanes and different devices that were produced on a large scale, and those devices had to be used by pretty much anyone, with the assumption that maybe they weren't very well trained in how to use it. So the best example is looking at airplane cockpits. And when they were deciding how to design a layout for an airplane, they tapped into people of the cognitive perspective because they wanted to look at how does the human mind work, how do people think about things, and how can we place all of the dials and gadgets in this plane cockpit in a way that would be intuitive for anyone to look at. How can we use what we know about the mind and how the mind works to make this more functional? And from that, people started realizing how useful it could be to understand how the mind works and start changing things in our environment. And so after the war, into the 1950s, the cognitive perspective started picking up again. And it became more and more popular, sometimes even more popular than the behavioral perspective. And because this rise in popularity occurred in the 1950s and into the 1960s, and it tended to coincide with the emergence of other technologies, like some of the early computers, a lot of terminology that was being used for computers ended up also transferring over and being used to talk about our cognitive perspective. And so when we talk about our information processing model, the idea that humans are processors of information, there's a lot of equivalents, a lot of parallels into computers. And when we start talking about how our memory works, how we store and retrieve memories, a lot of the terminology is the same as how we talk about storing and retrieving information from a hard drive. So you'll see lots of parallels there. And so this rise in the cognitive perspective led us into the cognitive revolution. So people became more and more interested in this field as they saw more and more applications for what this was giving us. And at the time, some of the major areas of explosive growth were in language learning. And so we had some behaviorists, so from earlier perspectives, and they figured that language is acquired specifically through our basic principles of learning. So someone from the behavioral perspective said that language learning isn't anything special, it's learned just like we learn anything else. But linguists and people into this cognitive perspective had a different idea. And they proposed that humans are biologically pre-programmed, again, that computer knowledge, we're pre-programmed to acquire language, and children come ready to understand languages with a set of mental rules. So this idea of pre-programmed rules or this ability to learn built in goes very much against that behavioral idea that everything comes externally. This pre-programming kind of implies that there's a genetic component. There's an innate or inborn ability to acquire language. And from our knowledge of today, the linguist's perspective here is a lot closer to what the truth is. Again, as far as we know. And so that's the history of our cognitive perspective, but what does our modern cognitive perspective look like? So the first of these is cognitive psychology. Pretty much what you'd expect, where we can focus on the study of mental processes, where you look at how people and other animals reason, make decisions, solve problems, how they perceive things, and also the production and perception of language. So this is pretty much a direct carry-on from what we talked about of the cognitive perspective. And it can be shaped and evolve through new processes. So we can have cognitive neuroscience being quite a newer field, where they can look at electrical recordings and brain imaging techniques, get into that behavioral level of analysis to study the brain activity during different cognitive tasks. And so our next perspective is the sociocultural perspective. So socio, looking at the social side of things, and cultural, looking at the cultural side of things. So in this perspective, we want to look at how our social environment and our cultural learning can influence our behavior, our thoughts, our feelings, all of those parts of psychology. And the sociocultural perspective overlaps quite a bit with all of our other perspectives. Behaviorism for the environmental influences, the cognitive perspective for that social cognition, that mental part of things, and biological because we're still evaluating those internal biological processes. So our sociocultural perspective is using all three levels of analysis that we mentioned earlier on. And so when we're talking about culture, we're talking about these shared values, beliefs, behaviors, and traditions that we can pass on and transmit within a culture. And we'll sometimes talk about what are called cultural norms, which are usually unwritten rules of behavior. So a cultural norm tells you how you should behave in an elevator, what is socially acceptable behavior when you stand in an elevator. That's the reason why you face the door when you get into an elevator and don't face the back of the elevator. And so related to this, cultural psychology looks at the transmission of culture. So what are some similarities and differences among people from different cultures across the world? And our last perspective is the biological perspective. So we're looking at the brain processes and other bodily functions regulate our behavior. So the biological level of analysis. And we can look at biological psychology, which is going to extend from the field of biology and connect it to the field of psychology. Lots of overlap and lots of interconnection. And so we're understanding how the biological functions can influence and connect to some of our psychological functions. And again, there's lots of crossover here. So we have behavioral neuroscience can fall under a biological perspective because we're looking at how the brain functions and how those functions in the brain underlie the things that we're seeing and feeling and thinking and doing. And one of the major proponents for this perspective is Carl Lashley. And so he had done a bunch of research looking at how lesioning or damaging parts of the brain could affect the performance of rats running in mazes. So if we damage this part of the brain, how does their behavior change? And so our modern brain imaging techniques are a little bit more sophisticated. We can put people or other animals into a brain imaging machine of some kind, and we can see what their brain is doing in response to different stimuli. And again, connecting into our cognitive neuroscience so we can look at what's happening while someone is thinking a particular thought or while they're hearing a particular sound. We can also look at behavior genetics, connecting behavior and the genetic side of things. How are our genes influencing our behaviors? So you could selectively breed rats for a particular behavior or a particular personality or something like that to see which genes are related to different physical effects. And we can look at evolutionary psychology, trying to explain how evolution shapes modern human behavior. So again, related to some of those early perspectives that we had talked about, but with a little bit more understanding maybe about the process of evolution. And the last one is sociobiology, still under this biological perspective, but adding socio to it, we're starting to consider the social side of things. So complex social behaviors can be built into the human species as part of our evolution. So maybe there's a genetic factor that's helping determine some of our social status. And so again, natural selection acting on those social traits and maybe helping us survive to live and reproduce in the future. And so if we've talked about all of these different perspectives, which one is correct? Which one is the one that you should be using? And hopefully at this point, we've gotten across the idea that no one perspective is going to be completely correct or completely right in any given moment. And we've talked about a lot of these perspectives are being overlapping and complementary and working together. So each perspective is not mutually exclusive of the others. So which one perspective is correct? None of them, and all of them. So you can pick a different perspective depending on which type of question you're trying to answer. And they're all going to interact and give you different ideas and ways of considering questions. And again, that's why psychology is so complicated and different, because we can look at questions from lots of different angles, from lots of different perspectives. And so this leads us to our conclusions about some of the shortcomings and challenges that we can encounter in psychology. So from what we've talked about, you should pick up on the idea that behavior is really hard to predict. There are so many other things going on. There are so many levels to consider and perspectives to use that it's really difficult to know exactly what any organism is going to do at any given time. Behavior is a tough one, which, considering we're studying psychology, where a good chunk of that is studying behavior, we're making it hard for ourselves. We should also know that psychological influences are rarely independent of one another. This is that idea that everything is complicated and interconnected. So you're never really going to get a clean picture when you're looking at something. The best we can do is try and pick it apart and figure out what factors are involved, but be aware it's going to be complicated. And on that idea of complications, people are unique, and we all have different individual differences. So if you're trying to study a particular thing in humans, you have to keep in mind that humans are different and variable and difficult to study. And on that note, people influence one another. There are social factors that can change how people behave. If you have somebody in a room by themselves doing a task, their behavior will be completely different if you have them do the task again, but with someone in the room. People influence other people, and we have to keep that in mind when trying to study them. And on the idea of social factors, behavior can often be shaped by culture and previous experience. So our big take-home message at the end of this is, it's complicated, and we should be aware that there are lots of challenges and problems that we can encounter in psychology, But it's worth trying to learn what we're learning about how our mind and our behavior all work together. So we just keep our shortcomings in mind as we move forward. And we will leave it there at the end of chapter 1.